But I should, so one day.
All right, all. So I've added a couple readings. One that I really recommend that you do for that will help solidify this class. I'm going to reference a couple places. Well, I'm drawing very heavily from the Wickham Tidy data paper certainly posted. Partly because it's as good as it gets for thinking about data set structure, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about today. So very strongly recommend that you do that. It's required. Probably ask some questions that draw from the paper. So that one's a good one. It's very tricky to do. I've also added one recommended reading related to Git and GitHub. Talk about what that is in just a second, but I'm definitely not expecting it to read it, but you may want it, please works. Also, we've decided to cancel drill for this week because spring break is coming up and travel plans and whatever. Also because, well, I'm going to talk about some new R content today, but I didn't talk about anything related to R on Monday. We will be assigning a minor homework. I say minor because it's like, I doubt it'll be like super involved. It's just like choose projects that you're either working on or you have worked on, and implement some of these structural things that we've talked about, like make sure that the folder structure is the way it's organized, the way that makes sense. Create a code book for all of your data sets. It's stuff that doesn't necessarily take long. Sometimes it can be a little bit tedious. Maybe it'll take, it depends on the state of your organization, maybe it'll take hours doing that. I doubt it'll be as involved as your typical homework, also because of spring break. So anyway, no drill, and you'll have a hopefully light, not too difficult homework. All right. We're going to be picking up where we left off on Monday. I was able to get through all the topics I want to talk about related to managing your projects, figuring out how to structure your organization scheme for data. And in particular, I wanted to talk about one element in this. This is the NIH project I talked about Monday. We're looking in the data folder. Here's one of the data sets. I want to talk about this thing called the codebook. You may have heard of codebooks before, but they're basically guides to whatever's in a data set. So you can have a codebook for your source data if your source data is organized like a table. You might have a codebook for that. You have images, maybe you don't have a codebook. You have a raw data set, you probably want to have a codebook for that. Certainly for your process data, whatever you're doing analysis on, because codebooks are one of the main things that make data shareable and useful for other people. So in general, when you're thinking about, this is like one way to document what's in your data sets. You should think of documentation both as a way of showing other people what's in your project, but also as information for future use. So my wife told me, I was just talking about stuff with her yesterday. She told me the story about how she came back to an EEG project that she was working on. Last time she worked on it was years ago, and she was like, where the heck did I even put these data sets? Because EEG data are very large, and you often need like an external hard drive or something to save them. She had no idea. But she had documented that information in the script that she used to process the raw EEG data. And she had written a note for herself. It's on this hard drive, which is located in this location in the lab, and she was able to find it. And it only took like 2 minutes, whereas maybe she wouldn't have found it if she hadn't been had those results. So when you're thinking about codebooks, don't just think about like documentation for other people, although that's good standard to use, but think about documentation for you too, because it can be hard to remember everything that's in your folders, your file structure. I find myself, especially if I do a good job of commenting the code that I use to go from source to raw data, raw to process, I reference those all the time, and I'm like, oh, that's what I did. Sometimes I even catch an error that I didn't catch in the first place, where I wouldn't be able to do that if my documentation with that error just would accept it. So with codebooks in particular, these can look, you can have a lot of stuff in codebooks, and there's not, in psychology, any sort of agreed upon standard for what a codebook ought to look like. This is a big gap in how psychologists document their stuff. So I'll go through what I put in my codebooks. I think of this as like the bare minimum of what a good codebook will look like. So it ought to have the variable names as they appear in whatever data set you're documenting. So whatever is at the top of your columns. A description of each of those things. So I like to put in, if it's a derived variable, like I calculated it, I'll give a description of what that derivation looks like. If it's a variable that was recorded in the source data, I might give like a short description of what that looks like, what happened there. And then lastly, the values that that each variable could take, hypothetically. So if it's 1 to 7 scales, 1 to 7. The reason that's important, the reason that's useful, has to do with data cleaning, which we'll talk about after the break. But that's one extra detail that can be extremely useful when looking at your data to figure out, are there any errors here? Was there a coding error? Is everything working as I expect? That's a very useful thing to check in those circumstances.
Patrick, would you make sure to include that and make that a separate file as opposed to adding it on your sheet into your data set?
I prefer to store all of my data sets as .csv files rather than Excel files. .csvs, that extension means comma separated value. It's literally a text file with a bunch of commas. Each comma separates each column. So you have like variable 1, comma, variable 2, comma. You can double click that and open it as an Excel spreadsheet. It looks like any other Excel file, except that it doesn't have the format that you have in Excel, that you would have in Excel. And it doesn't have things like extra sheets. The reason I store everything as CSVs is that they're portable. I can send that to anybody using any system, Mac, PC, Linux, whatever. It all goes. And Excel or CSV files also don't do things like, so there was this kind of funny error with a bunch of genetics papers where Excel was interpreting these sequences of DNA as dates. And it affected, I don't remember how many, there's a very large number, there were a large number of retractions. And that's because the data were stored in Excel. Excel does some funky things that are sometimes useful, but sometimes not. There was a case where they weren't useful, so you could sort if they had stored those files as CSVs, they wouldn't have that problem. Excel is a useful tool. I do use it quite a bit for like making nicely formatted tables that I want to show to people. I don't use it to store my data. Good question, by the way. Yeah.
I forgot if you mentioned it already, but what's that code sheets R file about?
Oh yeah, so this is showing how I have a file, a little script that I use to transform my data from source to raw. I call that code_sheets. The reason was that this little file downloaded the data from an online source. There was an online server that hosted all this, and then it did some things with those individual files. So coding the sheets. So I think it's useful to store like any sort of scripts that you do in the base file where your process data might live. Other questions? So codebooks. Codebooks are incredibly useful. It's a little piece of documentation, a little piece of like making that metadata available to you so that it can be useful, so that you can use it for yourself. So I highly recommend that you do this. It's just showing you what the contents of this codebook looks like. This was formatted actually in Excel because it makes it a little bit nicer, easier to read, rather than it's formatted as a CSV. So as participant ID, grant ID, those are those linking variables that we talked about on Monday, some descriptions, and the range of permitted values. It does this or it gives us information for all variables in this data set. There are quite a few, so like I said, it can't be tedious work with this. But very useful. So don't let the tedium prevent you from doing it. Absolutely need be, give it to a research assistant. But you may know the project better than them, so yeah, for mileage shaper. There is a package that someone wrote, I think last year. His name is Ruben Arslan. I believe this may have been a project from SEPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. Meets every year to work on making useful stuff for psychology research. I try to go every day. The reason I didn't show you how to use this is that I think it's not all that user-friendly at present, but there's a paper on SciArchive if you want to read it. That's the link. And it's trying to automate this task of making codebooks. So I think it's a cool idea. You can look at it to see what it has. Personally, I think it's not terribly user-friendly right now, but maybe it will be in the future. All right, so we're moving on to, that was all like how to structure your projects and document it. I'm going to talk very briefly about data security. I'm not going to linger on this too much, but I have, three main messages on security. So first of all, security does a couple different things that are somewhat related, but somewhat not. The first is, of course, if you're dealing with confidential data, you need some way of some unauthorized access to the data. That could look like, a password-protected server, putting up a barrier to make sure that only some people can access the data. That's a little bit at odds with the goal of making the data useful to other people. But it's good to be thinking about this stuff proactively. And sometimes you're dealing with data where it's the law. If you're dealing with health data, you might have to think about HIPAA, for example. So anyway, that's an important thing to think about. It's not as relevant for all projects, but it may be relevant for a project that you're working on. Related but somewhat separate to that is the goal of making sure that if data are lost in one place, they're not lost permanently. So I think I mentioned on Monday, I've had my computer crap out on me multiple times. Fortunately, it never did that before I started implementing some of the security things that I'll talk about in just a bit. I do know some people who have lost data this way. Don't be one of those people. Because stuff happens all the time, and you never know when something untoward will happen. Just don't put yourself at risk. Also, this is like part of respecting the participants' time too. If you're dealing with human subjects data, if you lose data, their time was wasted. So it's better not to be in that situation. And the last one might be something that, well, I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but security can also be useful for implementing what's called version control. The idea behind version control is that if you have a version control system, you can go back to, you can revert changes that you've made to a given file. So the idea is to checkpoint the changes that you're making and give yourself the ability to revert them if you discover that some sort of change that you didn't want was made to your files. So if you have version control, you're never in the position where, like, you say something that's like, whoops, I didn't actually want that, but I don't know how to go back and change it. That's never an issue. So highly recommend that you use some sort of version control. This kind of messy set of files is a crude version of version control. So what I did with this paper is every time I had a new major batch of revisions on the paper, I just changed the file name, saved a new copy of the file with the dates that I made those changes. That's a crude manual way of version control. It's fine, but there are some methods that you can use that are a little bit, well, sometimes they're easier to work with. There are some really nice ways of doing version control where you don't have to worry about this. One is a tool that you may already be quite familiar with, Dropbox. That's something that I use. So I store the research data where I don't have to think about things like HIPAA in Dropbox. There's a way, just like going to the Dropbox menu where you can revert changes that you've already made. Dropbox, that's one of the features that gives you, not only does it allow you access across devices, but also implements version control. It's one reason to like it, one reason to use it.
And is that you have to pay for it for so many gigs?
No, the free version does it too. The thing that the paid version gets you is extra space. So I used the free version for a long time. Now I'm paid for some extra space. It's not super expensive. I think if you can ask your PI if you want it reimbursed. This is something that I think would be very reasonable to reimburse. But also, yeah, there's a student version.
Do you know if the student version can access that after you're no longer here? I'm guessing what they do is they have a renewal period, at the next, I'm not sure how they enforce this. Maybe they have some way of checking whether your email is active at your university account. It's possible that you can just sort of sit on it. Sometimes I think I have an old version of Office. I'm not a student anymore, but I still have that version of Office. Dropbox I found is quite nice. I think it's great. I use it. That's a big part of how I secure my data. Another one that takes a little bit of extra work. So Dropbox, you just save things in Dropbox. So every time you save something, that creates a new version. The Open Science Framework also allows for version control. So if you upload stuff to the Open Science Framework, it has the same, if you upload a file that has the same name as the file that's already there, OSF will create a new version of that file. So all you have to do is keep the same name when you upload stuff to OSF. Got version control.
I don't save stuff to OSF as frequently as I save stuff to Dropbox because, of course, Dropbox I'm just kind of working. But I do upload stuff there at regular intervals, particularly if I want to share stuff with people. I give them the OSF link. And that's one of the reasons I do it. It's an extra security measure to make sure I don't do stuff.
Are there any confidentiality issues with storing things online?
For Dropbox, IRBs might not like it. What an IRB thinks, it's going to vary from IRB to IRB. I think Dropbox is pretty good about security, but it does freak me out a little bit. So if you like to stuff to this big company, the benefit of OSF is that they're a nonprofit. Their whole mission is to make stuff open, but in a way that respects security. They have the extra funds set aside to make sure that if OSF disappears, they can still run their servers like nothing will be lost because they can just draw those extra funds. So they did that specifically to get through IRBs and other regulations and requirements. They also have good security features. So if you're worried about security, OSF is a pretty good place to do it. You just keep things private. Another one that gets used a lot in software development, and there are some psychologists, some social scientists who are starting to use it too, is GitHub. It's practically a requirement to know how to use GitHub if you're interested in software development or in tech. This is something that comes up a lot, so it may be worth your time. I found it to be pretty counterintuitive. I've used it occasionally, but it's not a regular part of my workflow. But the supplemental reading that I gave you is a tutorial of how to use GitHub. GitHub is made for to allow version control, but also allow multiple people to work on the same project simultaneously and to make that be streamlined. So it may be worth your time to look into it. Like I said, I found the so I talked about how if you implement a certain organization system, there's a switch cost. Well, this is one manifestation of that. Even though I like the idea of GitHub, I haven't invested the time because it would just take a lot of effort to put everything on GitHub versus what I'm working with. But anyway, I'm giving it's a good option, something to look into if you're interested. So that's all I had on security. Big picture idea is implement some type of version control. It'll save your butt, and make sure that you have some way of restoring lost data. That'll definitely save your butt. So we're going to move on to the next topic. And actually, before I do that, any questions about security version control?
So, reading that code book, what are your thoughts on doing that for your source data and then for your raw data?
I think it's a good idea. Like I said, some source data won't allow you to make code book per se. So if you have a bunch of images and those are converted to, they're digitized and you extract things from those digital copies, that's not going to be, those images aren't going to be stored in the table. They're going to be like individual files. But you can still have a text document, a Word document, some just chunk of text that says, here's what's in this folder. It's a bunch of images, and I've named them using the participant ID that was referenced, or that this is an image of. That little text file is often called a README. They're used a lot in software development. READMEs are very standard. But the basic idea is it's just like some sort of chunk of text or something that you can double click to see what's here and how it happens. So that's why I recommend it. Other questions?
What about Google Drive?
Google Drive, I personally have found it to be less friendly for my workflow than Dropbox, and OSF. I do find it useful for collaboratively editing documents, so I do that. It's less easy to do that over Dropbox. Google Drive does have some elements of version control. I don't use it for storing any research data because I'm a little bit. Most of the big tech companies, it's hard to say how. I just worry. So I suppose I should be a little bit more worried about Dropbox maybe, but for whatever reason, I trust Dropbox a little bit more than I do Google. That said, a lot of my stuff is on Google, so it's not like I completely force myself. They do have, I do like their Google Docs. I do think that makes collaboratively writing fairly straightforward. Other questions? All right. Well, so we're moving away from like how to generally structure your projects into how to structure some of your files. In particular, we're going to be focusing on that process data set. So source data, in some ways that's the structure of your source data is determined by whatever you're using to collect your observations. Sometimes you have some control over what goes into the source data. Like if you're using a Qualtrics survey, you can control what the names of your variables are. I'll talk about variable names after a spring break, what these are a good variable name. But in general, you have a lot more control over how you structure your process data than you do your source data. So that's where I'm going to be most focused. As to what makes something, like what makes a structure useful, a useful structure is something that makes your tasks easy. So it makes it easy to visualize what's in your data set. It makes it easy to maintain your data sets. So you might find, for example, that over the course of like doing analysis that, oh, there's this one participant who just has like really crazy responses. We've done like outlier analysis or something. If your data set structure is useful, it makes it really easy to, either modify their responses to something that is more correct or omit that case for later analysis. Also, sometimes happens where, like, let's say you're doing a longitudinal analysis, you've got weight 1 and weight 2. If your data structure is useful, it's very easy to merge weight 1 with weight 2. That's what I mean by easy. It makes whatever you're doing with your data straightforward to do. So that's like kind of ambiguous. What does it even mean to have to make your tasks easy? Especially there are lots of tasks that you could do with data. What does that even mean? And actually, for a really long time, there was no formal writing on data set structure. That was just something that people did, and I guess there were people who worked with databases and background databases, and so there's some computer science literature on this. There wasn't a lot of writing for scientists and the people who were doing a lot of the analysis. That's something that's really changed within the past, I'd say 10 years. So this is something that's advancing really rapidly. And someone to follow if you're interested in some of these topics of how to structure data sets, how to make things easy, is Hadley Wickham. He's the chief scientist at RStudio. RStudio, of course, is what we're using to interact with R. So he's one of the people who wrote that software. The required reading for this unit was written by Hadley Wickham. There are actually a lot of people who are like connected to the R community, developers for open source tools in R, who are thinking pretty hard about this stuff. This is a topic that's, changing rapidly. So I recommend that you, if you're interested, go look at what Hadley Wickham is doing, and there's new stuff coming out all the time. Hadley introduced this idea of tidy data. So you've seen that word before because we're using this whole suite of functions that are all called the tidyverse. So the tidyverse functions, the tidyverse family of packages, are all built around this idea of tidy data. That if you have data that's tidy, it makes it easy to do stuff. ggplot2 is built around the idea of tidy data as well. The whole idea behind tidy data is that, well, first of all, just to define some terms here, you can think of data as consisting of values. They're like numbers, chunks of text, whatever. I use the term observations and then measurements to be the recordings that you're taking of those observations. Those measurements would be the values. They're just like numbers, whatever. Measurements can be really varied. So data are values that have certain structure. And one part of that structure is that often data refer to certain units of analysis. So a unit of analysis could be a person. It could be a school that person belongs to. It could be a business. Basically, these units are groupings of measurements that have some sort of logical cohesion. They all belong together for one reason. So that's one of the elements of structure. You have these values, or use the term measurements as well, along with these observational units. So some of these values go together. Another part of structure in data is this idea of a variable. So a variable you can think of as like a class of measurements. So if you have people take a survey, one of those sets of survey responses would be a variable. If you're doing a reaction time task, the reaction time could be one of your variables. If you have people separate by conditions, condition could be one of those variables. So it's another element of structure. We have certain sets of values that go together because they're all about this one observational unit, they're all about one person. We also have certain sets of values that go together because they're the same type of measurement. So the grouping of values that go together because they're the same observational unit, I'm going to call that a case. Hadley Wickham uses the term observation, but I've been using that term to mean like the scientific thing of interest, like seeing the thing and taking a picture of it. It's a little bit of a confusing terminology. So case just means that all these things belong to the same observational unit. Variable means that it's all the same type of measurement. A lot of data follows this kind of structure. So the idea behind tidy data is that we can sort of structure our data to reflect the structure of our experiment. Specifically, we can make sure that each variable has its own column. So we're thinking about like a table, for example, with rows and columns. So each variable is going to get its own column. Each case will get its own row. And we're going to store each observational unit, so information about businesses versus information about a specific person in its own spreadsheet, its own table. And that's the idea behind tidy data. It seems kind of basic, maybe, except that actually this idea is quite powerful. And it makes a lot of things pretty easy. There are some cases where you might want to break these rules, where you might want to use untidy data. I'll get into that maybe a little bit later, especially when we get into repeated vectors, which is the next thing. But this does make a lot of things really easy, and it makes the immunity very easy. All right, I think these principles are easiest to understand when you see how they can be violated. Hadley Wickham has said in many talks that all tidy data look kind of the same, but data can be untidy in many different ways. It's supposed to be a Redfern and a Grenina. All hack tables are the same. All unhacked tables are different. I don't remember what the exact quote is, but it is true that untidy data can be untidy in many, many different ways. Usually there's only one or two options for each type of data. So I'm going to go through a couple different ways that tidy data or data can be untidy. And I don't think that this is an exhaustive list, but it covers many of the different variations that you might see. One variation of this is that sometimes people use values as the labels of the columns rather than the names of the variables. So I'll show you schematically what this looks like. So this is a very simple data set. Let's just imagine that I have three people, three different IDs, and then I have one column that indicates, let's say it's like the number of, it's like the ages between 24 and 27. So that might be the column heading. And this could be the count of people, let's say in a particular school district, that are between 25 and 27. This column could be another grouping of values. It's like the number of people from 27 to 30. So notice that even though these are used as columns, that's actually a useful piece of data. It's a way of, it's a variable that gives meaning to this 5 and 4. So if we want to make these data tidy, we've got to somehow move those labels for those columns into these rows. There's a particular function that is in the tidyverse family of packages. All these are, or most of these functions that I'm going to show you are in the package tidyver. This one is called gather. And what it does is it takes some values that are stuck up here in the columns, and it moves them down into the body of the data. I've got a little animation that shows you what this process looks like because it's a little bit hard to understand if I'm just talking about it. It really helps to be able to see it. So this is what happens if I run this command on this set of values. What I'm doing is I'm making a new column called variable that says, hey, this value right here belongs to the grouping of people between 24 and 27. This one belongs to the grouping of people between 20 and 30, and so on. That becomes a new column. I have to expand the number of rows because that's information that you get from these being in the headers. So this is like a compact way of displaying the data. But once I've expanded the number of rows, once I've doubled the number of rows, one for each grouping of data underscore 1 and data underscore 2, that makes my data tidy. Suddenly, each of these rows belongs to, say, school district 1, which has a data 1 row and a data 2 row. This is a very powerful idea. So one way that you can make data tidy is if you recognize that you're in a situation where, hey, my columns are referring to a variable of grouping of my values, some way of understanding my values. You can use this gather function to expand your data up and create a new column that indicates that grouping variable.
It seems very counterintuitive to me, because why would you just not label your variable name as people over 20 pages?
I've got an example next that maybe makes this a little bit more intuitive. And then there's one specific, very important type of data set where you often see this issue. So let's go to the next example, and then I'll talk about that type of data set where you often see this. Okay. So to ground you in a specific problem, it's kind of hard to understand this if this is like very abstract. I'm going to show you a table that was taken from a Pew report. And it could be, this is an example that is in that tidy data paper, by the way. Happily we can talk about this. But this is literally Pew data that was reported in the report. So this is a bunch of different religions, and this is the count of people from the survey that fall into different income brackets. It's a pretty big table. This is only part of the table, but it is a pretty compact way of reporting this information. So there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with untidy data. Some forms of untidy data can be useful in some circumstances. But if we wanted to tidy these data to do something else with them, one thing we could do is gather those row headers. So below 10,000, from 10,000 to 20,000, and so on. And move them into their own column. So what I've done here is I've got a new column called income, and all those things that used to be like smushed up in all these different places in the table are now in a single column called frequency. Really what these data are showing is frequencies. That's like one variable that can be categorized in a bunch of different income brackets. So suddenly what was 6 columns becomes 2 columns. But my data set is much longer. So I mentioned there's one other like very important classic data set that social scientists use all the time that is often presented untidily, and that's longitudinal data. So you often see data sets presented where you have depression scores measured at 3 times. You've got a column for depression score measured at time 1, time 2, and time 3. Well, if those columns are called like depression 1, depression 2, depression 3, that's actually, those are actually values that are lodged up in the column headers. So one way to tidy that kind of data set is to gather those column headers together, create a new variable called time 1, time 2, time 3, and another variable called depression. Yeah.
For some longitudinal data, then wouldn't it almost make sense to have the values in the headers? Just so that you have like one participant ID and you have all their data in one row.
Well, that depends. I could imagine some cases where that would make more sense if you have a lot of information about participants that does not change over time and only 3 variables that do.
Right, like all their demographic.
Yeah.
variables.
But I'll have more to say about that in just a bit. But if you have multiple things that are measured at 3 times, well, let's say you have 10 variables, multiply that by 3, you have 30 columns. Maybe your data would be easier to work with if you tidy the data set, particularly if you wanted, for example, to know the overall means of each of depression and anxiety and whatever else you're measuring. Or by time, if you wanted group summaries at each time point. Well, there's easy ways to get group summaries at each time point. You can use describe by, or the tidyverse has functions that do the same thing.
So it might like depend on how you're planning on analyzing your data.
The main way that I'm going to teach you to analyze longitudinal data requires tidy data. But there's another common way of analyzing this data that helps for, sometimes it's convenient to use that method, and it also helps for understanding. So when we get into that unit, I'm going to start with the untidy version and then move into the tidy version. But to answer your bigger question, yeah, sometimes it's convenient to structure data in an untidy way for certain tasks. One important idea of this unit is to structure data in a way that makes your tasks easy. Often that means structuring your data in a tidy way. Other questions? Okay. The second way that these tidy principles can be violated is if you have multiple variables all structured in one column. I don't think sometimes I see this in research data actually. Should never say that. Just data collection programs are all different. Some people, it's very uncommon to have formal instruction on data management, so sometimes you'll be getting data sets that run time. So should never say you'll never see this. I think it's a little bit less common than the one I just went through. So one way this could happen is you have 2 variables, variable 1 and variable 2, on column keys V1 and V2, each of which have 2 levels, level 1 and level 2. One way I could structure those data is I have one column for each combination of variable 1 and variable 2. And I have a value for each person in each of those combinations of variable 1 and variable 2. Let's say you're doing a completely cross design, for example, and you have you're working with a 2x2 design. You have one column for condition 1 of variable 1 and condition 2 of variable 2, and so on down the line. This is one way that those data could be structured. So, of course, this is a bit of a problem because not only do we have that issue of like having values in the header of this data set, but this the fact that we have this underscore here is kind of a tell that we have a set of values that belong in level 1, variable 1, and level 2, variable 1. But we've also got variable 2 to worry about. We've smushed these two variables together. So the fix for this is a two-stage process. Not only do we have to gather those column headers, just like we did in the previous example, but then we've got to do another step. We've got to separate variable 1 from variable 2. So I'll show you what that looks like. So it's a two-stage process, and I'm showing you at the very end, you can even like have a much cleaner representation of level 1 and level 2 just by having 1 and 2. That makes it much clearer how the data set is structured. I think this is one example where tidying your data set, creating these multiple variables, and then just labeling them 1 and 2 makes it much clearer what's being represented in the data. So in the old structure, where we have 4 columns, the data are kind of hard to understand, I think. It's much easier to understand the structure of these data once we've done this two-stage tidying process. If I didn't say it explicitly, there's a function that does this separation called separate. Makes sense, separating 2 columns that used to be joined. That's the only difference. Then I also I made the text labels 1s and 2s just to make it clear what's happening. But that was an optional stuff. Okay, so again, I think this is easier to understand in the context of an actual data set. So these are data about tuberculosis cases. Again, this is a real data set that Kevin Wickham found out there, posted on the internet. So we've got country, year, and a bunch of columns called M014, M1324. There are a lot of them. I'm not showing all of them. Those M's represent male tuberculosis cases, the F's represent female tuberculosis cases, and the numbers represent an age group. So the age from 0 to 16, the age from 17 to, 0 to 14, 15 to 24, and so on. This is a kind of in my opinion, a strange way of representing these data, pretty hard to understand. So one thing we could do to make it easier to understand is first recognize that we've got these 2 variables smushed up together in the headers. In the first stage, we do this gathering process, where we get all of those column headers together and make a new variable for those column headers. Then our data set gets much longer than it used to be. But this column still represents an aggregation of 2 variables, male versus female cases and different age groups. So after we're done, we also need to, I've got the text wrong up there. I realized I'll fix these things of blue text. This is supposed to be separated. But basically, once we separate that column into sex and age, we've got a data set that makes a lot more sense. I think on this data set, one of the benefits of tidy data also becomes a bit more clear. So let's say that we wanted to weight the count of tuberculosis by the number of people in a given country. So these are different countries at different times that have varying populations. If you have 50 cases in a small country, that's going to be much less worrisome than if you have, or much more worrisome than if you have 50 cases in a country with 10 million people. So that's a common thing that you might want to do with data that look like this. You can sort of do that in the first representation of the data. I think it's much easier to add a column in this representation of the data that says like population, and use that column to divide each of these numbers by that population. Whereas it's much harder to figure out how exactly to add those extra data if they're all squished up like on top. So that's another place where you can sort of see why tidy data might be easier to work with than tidy data. The third way that this principle can be violated is if you have variables that have somehow made their way into the rows. So you might have a data set that has a structure like this. Each person has multiple rows, and you've got multiple variables on each person. You've got their depression and anxiety scores. But that's if we're trying to make our data tidy, those variables, those common set of measurements, ought to be in columns rather than in rows. So to distinguish why this might be a problem sometimes, whereas before I was saying like, hey, we've got values that are in rows. Imagine this is a case where you have like depression and anxiety scores mixed together. You don't want to average together both depression and anxiety because they're different things. They're conceptually different things. Whereas when I was talking about how you can have stuff, you can have values that are mixed up in the column headers. That's the case where you have depression. It's the same thing measured multiple times. It's just that we've got another way of understanding what makes one measurement different from another. The fact that they were measured at different times. Yeah.
Okay, I guess my point of confusion with this is the whole, each case has its own row. I think I'm referring more to like an earlier example of the violations, but I guess I'm confused, like when you're repeating the ID, because then it's not each case, it doesn't feel like each case is having its own row, because the ID is multiple times.
Yeah, so when I say each case has its own row, that doesn't mean that each person has to have their own row necessarily. If the same person gets exactly the same battery measurements multiple times, obviously there is a link between the first time they get the measurement and the second time. That's the thing that's indicated by the ID. But if it's all the same battery measurements, then there is a structure that you want to respect between those different sets of measurements. You're getting all the same thing every time. So the requirement to be tidy does not mean that you have no IDs that repeat. You can have IDs that repeat. That's fine. It is true, though, to go back to the point that you made before, that sometimes certain tasks are easier with separate time 1 and time 2 depression columns. So that isn't to say that like you never want to use the untyped version. Yeah, sometimes you do. But yeah, a lot of why it's useful to know these data transformations is knowing what the different ways you have available to you to present data, and that allows you to do certain things more easily in some cases than others.
Yeah.
Another way to understand this, let's say you have a bunch of pupils all in a single classroom, multiple classrooms. So there, I think most people would want to represent that not by having a group of class 1 variables and a group of class 2 variables. Instead, they might want to have like an ID variable for class ID, and have rows for each student. But in a certain way, that data set has the same structure as some data set where you have people measured multiple times. It's just that you have classes that are measured multiple times, or multiple time means I take different people from that class.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay. So I've got this data set where I have variables that are mixed up in rows. The way I would fix that is by using a function called spread. It's another function from the tidying package. What spread does is it takes two variables that are, or any number of variables that are in this column, and it makes one column, extra columns for each type of variable. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here, our data set gets more compact. It gets wider, and we take out a bunch of rows. And all we're doing is we're taking what used to be separate rows and spreading them out along the columns.
So it's the opposite of the gather.
Exactly the opposite. If you want to undo a gather, you do a spread. Here's a more concrete example of this. These are actual data from, it's the maximum and minimum temperature on given dates in a bunch of different countries. MX 17004 is a particular weather station in Mexico. This data set has a bunch of these. And the way these data are stored is we have separate rows for the maximum and minimum temperatures. Seems like I wouldn't necessarily want to, like, for example, average together the maximum or the minimum. I'd want to take the average of the maximum or the minimum. So it seems like this is better represented as separate columns of two separate variables rather than one column of two variables mixed together. And one way I could do that is do a spread. And if I do the spread, I get a separate minimum and maximum columns. The fourth violation of tidying principles is if you have multiple units of analysis in the same data set. So if we're making our data tidy, if we're measuring a bunch of information about schools and a bunch of information about individual pupils, those ought to be stored in separate data sets. This is one case where even though the tidiest version of the data has separate data sets, for analysis, we often end up grouping the data together. We want one data set where everything's located. So this is another example of where the untidy version of the data might be good for most analyses. For the maintenance of the data, though, generally the tidy version is better. I'll touch back on that in just a second. But to make this concrete, let's imagine I have pupil IDs and school IDs. I have a variable measured on pupils, and I have a variable measured on schools. And notice whenever I have the same school, school 1, they get the same value. But whenever I have school 2, they have the same value. Whenever I have the same pupil, I have the same value. Whenever I have the same, so pupil 1 has 5 and pupil 2 has 8. So the fact that I have to repeat certain values across multiple rows might imply that I could represent this as 2 separate data sets that could be merged together, but they didn't have to be together. One way I could do that is using the function unique. And what that shows you is that I can represent these very compactly as 2 separate data sets. I just realized one mistake I made here. I ought to have another column for school ID in the pupil data set so that I can make the link back from the soccer data sets to merged data sets. So that's that idea if I do want a key variable to help enable these merges. But basic idea, you're basically eliminating the repetitions across the data sets. So to make this concrete, this is a data set of Billboard rankings of a bunch of songs. And one thing that might be hard to see here is that we have like information about the songs over here. And we have information about the particular ranks that songs have over here. So the week of the ranking, the dates, and so on. One tell that this is sort of like multiple observational units smushed together is that I have these repeated variables in the data set, or these repeated values, right? That's a common tell that you've got this like nested structure. So one way you could fix that is by using unique to create separate track and rank data sets. And of course, if you do this, you'd want to leave a key variable to allow the merge to stay in the opposite direction. So again, I mentioned how with this problem of having multiple observational units mixed together, it's not always a problem because sometimes you need that for that first data set for analysis. But one thing that is easier on separate data sets is maintaining the data. So if you find out, oh, loser is actually a bit longer, it's 4 minutes long, and you want to update that value, you only have to do it in one place if you have separate data sets, whereas you have to do it in multiple places with merged data set. So general idea is that for storing data, the separate data sets is a little bit better, particularly if you have very large data sets. For analysis, often the merged data set is a little bit more. Although, if you wanted to show like a histogram of the times of each of these tracks, you want to use the separate data set because otherwise you're showing a histogram with like 3 values for loser, and everything rather than 1. So for some things, these sets are still going to be better. This is another idea that's relevant to longitudinal analysis because often you have things that don't change about the person, and things that do. So the things that don't change about the person might be like, survey variables that you get before you do a study. For long-term storage of that information, often the separate data sets is a little bit better. But you might also want to have the merged data set, or at least make the working processor easy. Okay, so one final violation of these tidy principles, and that is you have one observational unit that's spread across multiple files. So what this might look like is, it's often the case when you're doing an EEG study or some other kind of intensive process with each participant that you bring into a lab study, you end up with separate files, one for each participant. So I've called this first file p1.csv. So p1 might be like an ID variable for that participant. I've also got p2, p3, p4, p5, and so on. And I have a whole source data folder with all these separate data sets, one per person. But in order to tidy these data, I kind of want all these information about these people to all be aggregated together in one data set, rather than spread across multiple data sets. So there's a way to do this in R programmatically, so that I don't know if you've had to do this or someone's asked you to do this, maybe like literally cut and paste values from one spreadsheet to another. Don't do that. So the reason I recommend against that is that one, it's very tedious, two, it's very easy to make a mistake, three, it's very easy to lose information, and then you don't have a paper trail once you're done as to what you did. So don't do that. Save yourself some time and make the process more reproducible. The way you do that is there's a function to say, like, give me all of the file names that end in .csv in this particular folder. So that's this first line up here. List.files, I've got a folder called source_data, and I'm saying give me everything that's a CSV. So that gives me a bunch of file names. This, by the way, is one place where structuring your workspace ends up paying dividends. Because if you've got a nice file or folder with a bunch of common files, this process becomes very easy. Map is a function that says, apply a function to each element in this list of file names. So what this says is, hey, I want to use read.csv one time for each of the file names that I've got. This next line says, okay, I want to make sure that I don't lose information about which file that these data sets came from. I want to make sure that each row is labeled participant 1, participant 2, participant 3, wherever they came from. So that makes sure that happens. And then finally, I can use a function called bind rows that says, take all these separate data sets together and make them one data set. And so on. So this is what that looks like if you apply this code. Basically, we're squishing these data sets together, and we get an extra row called ID that says which file each data set came from, for each one.
you want like only certain portions of that file?
You can,
Do that afterwards?
yeah, I would probably do that afterwards. It is possible to write a custom function that goes at the end when you do math. But I think it would probably be easier to clean up the results after you use it. All depends on the particular, on your particular workflow and what the data, or how the data are structured. It is possible for sure. Okay, now I'm going a little bit late, but just to reiterate the topics from this lecture. So make sure to make code books. You're future-proofing yourself against like forgetting what the heck it is that you're doing, and you won't forget. Just the nature of things. And these should contain variable names in a given data set, description of those variables and the values that are possible. Make sure to secure your projects using some type of version control. And a very useful structure to understand is this tidy structure. It's not as though all tasks that you'll be doing involve tidy data, but tidy data does make lots of things pretty easy. And that will be an idea that we'll come back to next week and when we get to longitudinal analysis. Tidy data have separate variables in the columns, separate cases in the rows, and they have separate tables for job spatial. Thanks, and enjoy your spring break.